Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Hiram Chodosh. I'm Dean of the College of Law, and it's a great honor to welcome you to this keynote address by Dr. Peter Gleick, one of the world's visionary experts on the environment and on water in particular. My dear colleague and our very own renowned water expert, Bob Adler, will introduce Dr. Gleick in a moment, but I wanted to steal a little bit of your time today to thank, most of all, the Tanner Center for Nonviolent Human Rights Advocacy, its fabulous director, Tom Maloney, and his talented staff, as well as the many other university partners and sponsors for allowing us at the law school to work together on this very important conference on water, conflict, and human rights. Water is thicker than oil, or even thicker than blood in some parts of the world, and the challenges posed by our global and individual thirst for water are both daunting and complex, thus requiring unique forms of interdisciplinary imagination and collaboration. And that is exactly what the organizers have developed for us all here this week. I want to thank and congratulate each and every one of you, including those of you who've come to participate on that side of the podium here today and over the next couple of days. And I'd like to turn the podium over to my dear friend Bob Adler, who will introduce our keynote speaker today. Thank you very much all for coming.
Thank you, Dean Chodosh. Let me add my welcome to all of you today. As the Dean mentioned, this keynote, second keynote, is part of a 2.5-day conference on water, conflict, and human rights, sponsored by the Tanner Center for Nonviolent Human Rights Advocacy. And I'd like to invite those of you who haven't joined us this morning to join us this afternoon, tomorrow morning, and early tomorrow afternoon up at the Fort Douglas Officers Club for the rest of the conference. It's free, no registration required. Please join us. So we're here to talk about the human right to water. And in this building, we talk a lot about rights of various kinds, rights that some might think are loftier, are cherished First Amendment rights like freedom of religion and freedom of speech and freedom of the press and the right to assemble and petition your government, like we've seen played out so dramatically in Egypt in the past few weeks. Essential legal protections like due process of law and equal protection of law. Safeguards of our personal freedom, like the right to be secure against unlawful searches and seizures, and the right to privacy, and political rights, like separation of powers and states' rights, issues that are rocking the country and at the center of our domestic political debate. But nowhere in the US Constitution do we even find the word water, much less a right to water. Last night, Maud Barlow, our first keynote speaker, reminded us that in 1948, when the UN Declaration on Human Rights, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was adopted, water was not included. Because even back in 1948, no one could imagine the global crisis in water that we face today, and that many people around the world face critical water shortages. So certainly along the eastern seaboard of North America in the late 18th century, the authors of the US Constitution could not possibly have known the water crisis that we face today, and that this might be an issue of individual rights or human rights. But in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson very famously wrote that all of us have an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And folks, without water, there can be no life, much less any of the liberties that I talked about earlier. I know that many of you probably think that certain other liquids are more important to the happiness part of the equation. But as Maud Barlow also noted last night, there is a growing recognition of a human right to water in international, if not in domestic law, including a noted UN proclamation last year establishing a right to water at the international level. Yet declarations take us only so far, because in meeting that aspiration, we face a litany of significant problems. Chronic scarcity in some regions, inadequate financial resources or access to intellectual capital or expertise in others, inequitable distribution of water, extortionist prices for water where it's available in some parts of the world, and many others. And now we face the significant threat that climate disruption will exacerbate all of those problems globally. So picking up on the theme of today's keynote, we need new solutions to the world's water crisis. And there are few people in the world who are better suited to addressing those challenges and to proposing effective solutions than Dr. Peter Gleick. On my bookshelf, I have a series of books called Biennial Reports on the World's Freshwater Resources, conceived, edited, co-authored by Dr. Gleick. One of them was cited this morning by one of our speakers. I consider them among the Bibles of all things water, all wisdom and knowledge about water around the world. But that is on top of scores of other book chapters and reports and articles on water resource issues, including, I would note, an article that he wrote on the human right to water about a decade ago in the journal Water Policy, when few others had the foresight to be thinking about water as a human right. His latest book is entitled Bottled and Sold, the story behind our obsession with bottled water. I'm happy to see that we have no bottled water today, only cups of water. Dr. Gleick has a bachelor's degree in engineering from Yale, both a master's and a PhD in energy and resources from UC Berkeley. He's been recognized widely for his contribution to water science and policy, including fellowships from the MacArthur Foundation, the International Water Resources Association, memberships in the International Water Academy, the National Academy of Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and a list of keyboard and committee participation that would take me his entire lecture to itemize, so read his CV for that. He co-founded and is currently and has for many years been the president of the Pacific Institute for Studies in Development, Environment, and Security in Oakland, California. And we are also all to congratulate him because just 2 days ago, the Pacific Institute received the U.S. Water Prize from a consortium of water utilities and environmental groups and other water groups in Washington, D.C. Tremendous accomplishment for his longstanding organization. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Gleick.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And Bob, thank you very much for that extremely generous introduction. The only problem is he said in 5 minutes what I'm going to take another 40 minutes to say. So that's the danger. My thanks also to the Tanner Center for inviting me and for organizing the symposium. It's been very interesting so far, and it promises to be even more interesting. To Dean Chodash and to the law school for hosting the talk. It's a great honor to be here. Also, the organizers must be prescient to some degree. I know this conference was organized a long time ago. I think my first email about this was in July or August last year, but the timing couldn't be better. Just in the last few months, there's been some remarkable progress, some remarkable new events in the long saga of the debate about the human right to water, and so the timing is great. What I'd like to do this afternoon is talk about the nature of the world's water crisis, and in particular, some new solutions. I can be optimistic, I can be pessimistic. I'm going to be a little more optimistic today. I think there are remarkable solutions out there. I think that it's inevitable we're going to move to those solutions. I don't know how long it's going to take or how bad it's going to be before we get there, but I think there's good news out there. And I'm going to do it in the context of this question about the human right to water. I think we're desperately in need of new thinking about water. Our current use of water, as you heard last night with Maud Barlow's talk, as you read every day, is out of balance. It's unsustainable. We hear the headlines, we see the evidence every day, from new outbreaks of cholera in Haiti and Zimbabwe, to farmers fighting with farmers over water, to cities taking water from farmers, to climate change, to depleted reservoirs and aqueducts along the Colorado River, from cities in Nevada trying to take water that some other people believe may belong to them in neighboring states. I think that ultimately and inevitably we'll move to a future in which our water use is sustainable, our planning is sustainable, our management is sustainable, to what I call a soft path for water. But there are lots of routes to that positive future, and some of them are more attractive than others. I would note, there was bottled water up here on the podium when I walked in the room. My understanding is that Salt Lake City has some of the most wonderful tap water in the country, which, I mean, it tastes pretty good to me. And so the whole question about bottled water is another one that I'm not really going to touch on, but I just raise the awareness that it's an issue everywhere I go. We've made enormous progress in solving water problems over the last several centuries as civilization has expanded, as cities outgrew their local water supplies, as we began to generate huge quantities of wastewater, as we had to grow more and more food for growing populations. The last few centuries has also been a time when science and knowledge and technology has made incredibly rapid advancements as well. We really have taken great leaps forward. We've learned how to apply engineering and biology and chemistry and physics and politics to some degree to our water challenges. Once upon a time, not so long ago, water-related diseases were rampant everywhere in the United States and Europe, cholera and dysentery and typhoid and more. But as our understanding of water improved, we saw remarkable changes. We saw the first machines that were developed to provide water supply, the first physical and chemical and biological treatment systems for large centralized water problems, for large concentrations of wastewater. We saw the first dams of gigantic scale built to hold back floods and to store water in wet periods so that we could use that water in dry periods. We developed and deployed technology that built aqueducts not tens of kilometers long, which of course the Romans did, but hundreds and thousands sometimes of kilometers long, to move water over mountains from places where we had water to where we wanted it. We saw large-scale irrigation systems that were designed to permit farmers to grow food in places and at times that previously were not possible. And that's permitted us to meet the food needs of billions of people that otherwise we would not have been able to support. And it's now the 21st century, and we've all benefited from those advances. We all grew up in this era of rapidly changing water. And we're feeding 7 billion people because of the green revolution, which people talk about as a revolution of fertilizer and crop type and pesticides, but I would argue is as much a revolution of irrigation technology. We're far less vulnerable to floods and droughts than our ancestors were, but it's the 21st century and things are changing again. Water is once again taking center stage as the most critical resource issue of our time, and my energy friends would like to debate that with me, but it's certainly one of the top two. So why? Why is that the case? Despite the enormous advances that and energy and water, of course, are completely integrally related, which I'm not going to get a chance to talk about. So you can't talk about energy without talking about water. You can't talk about water without talking about energy. And you can't talk about either one without talking about climate change. But why did we have these water problems? Despite the advances we've made, despite the benefits that we've all experienced directly from our water systems and our management and technology and policy and infrastructure and institutions, despite the hundreds of billions of dollars or trillions of dollars that the world has spent on, that utilities have spent, towns, cities, countries, the world as a community have spent, we still have a global water crisis. We haven't solved all of our water problems, even the traditional ones, and we have some new ones, and we better think about solving those. So what do I mean when I say we have a global water crisis? What is it? What does it look like? I'm going to talk briefly about that. Maud talked about it last night a little bit, and I don't want to depress you, but let me characterize it a little bit. First of all, populations continue to grow, and we continue to fail to meet basic human needs for water and sanitation. And that, in my opinion, is the biggest aspect of the global water crisis. There are a billion people or so that still lack safe drinking water. There are 2.5 billion people that still lack adequate sanitation services, something everyone in this room takes completely for granted. And I would note that 2.5 billion people is more people than were on the planet in 1940. So we've made progress, but there is a massive unmet need for basic water services around the world. And the consequences of failing to meet basic human needs for water are water-related diseases: cholera, dysentery, typhoid, guinea worm, schistosomiasis, the bad things that people get when they don't have access to clean water and sanitation. And 2 million or so deaths a year, mostly of children under the age of 5, from those water-related diseases that are completely preventable. This isn't a difficult health issue. We know how to solve water-related diseases and prevent water-related diseases, but we fail to do that. Second, water quality challenges are continuing to grow. Different forms in different places at different times. There are human wastes, there are industrial wastes, there are different kinds of industrial wastes, there are different kinds of institutional challenges, but we have not met the global water quality issue adequately. And there's an old Kashmiri proverb that says, it's easy to throw anything into a river, but difficult to take it out again. And that's it right there. We dump our wastes into our aquatic systems, and it's hard to take it out again. Third, food production requires water. In fact, the vast majority of the water that humans use, 80% or so in the Western United States, 80% or so around the world, goes to grow food. And while we've done remarkable things with food production, we face some new challenges. The area of irrigated land worldwide is growing, but very, very slowly. And it's growing more slowly than population. And so that means per capita, the amount of irrigated land available per person on the planet is going down. And that means if we want to continue to meet the food needs of a growing population, we have to get more efficient, more effective at growing food on the land that's in production. And the 20th century shows a remarkable improvement in the yields and the productivity of ag land, but we have to race forward if we're going to keep meeting growing population demands. We basically have to get more from what we have. Second, many regions of the world are experiencing unsustainable overpumping of groundwater. We have surface water, we have water in lakes, we have rivers, we have rainfall that provides a lot of the water for soil moisture and agriculture, and we have groundwater. It turns out that a lot of the groundwater we use is being used faster than nature naturally recharges it. So groundwater levels drop. It's unsustainable. It's often fossil groundwater laid down just like oil over eons and not recharged on a time scale that is relevant to us. By some estimates, as much as 30 to 40% of all food production comes from unsustainable groundwater use. And we can keep doing that for a while, but ultimately, we're going to have to find another source of water to provide that water for the food that we're already growing. That's a problem, and it's a problem we've not tackled. Fourth, the conflict between human uses of water and ecosystem uses of water is very real, and it continues to grow. For too long, all of the water that we humans use has been taken from ecosystems that also have used that water, and we haven't paid any attention to that. Originally, because we didn't understand that that was an issue. Then we didn't really care about it, and now we sort of understand it and we're increasingly caring about it, but we don't really know what to do about it because it's a fundamental conflict. And so those ecosystems, which provide goods and services that are really important to us, even if we can't put a dollar value on them, are being devastated. Many species of fish are threatened or endangered with extinction. Some aquatic ecosystems have been completely destroyed. By some estimates, a third of all North American freshwater fauna population are considered threatened with extinction, and we measure that better in the US, but it's a trend that's mirrored elsewhere around the world. Adequate flows of water don't reach the deltas of major rivers anymore. The Colorado River is completely used up before it reaches the delta. The Yellow River in China, for parts of the year, doesn't reach the delta. Very minor flows reach the delta of the Nile. Deltas are remarkably rich ecosystems. They provide nutrients for fish, they're nurseries for fish, they're flyways for birds, I won't go into all the benefits, but we are consuming even the renewable resources of the planet, the renewable water resources of the planet in the form of rivers. And that causes ecosystem problems. And maybe the best example of our failure to really understand the ecological implications of what we do is the Aral Sea in the former Soviet Union. It's a terminal lake, and those of you who are from Utah understand what a terminal lake is, because you have the biggest one in the US. Water goes in, and there's no outflow except from evaporation. The Aral Sea is like that, and the rivers that fed the Aral Sea are the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, and in the Soviet Union in the 60s and the 70s, under their planned central economy, they decided that water would be good for growing cotton in the desert. And the truth is that water was great for growing cotton in the desert. And so they took it all effectively, and the Aral Sea got smaller and smaller because inflow dried up and outflow continued with evaporation. And all 24 species of fish that were found nowhere else in the world but the Aral Sea are now extinct because of the increasing salinity, the shrinking of the sea. It's a good example of our ability, intentionally or unintentionally, to destroy ecosystems with our water policies. One last comment about the environment. We are fundamentally changing the climate, and that's going to have serious impacts on water resources. The hydrologic cycle, evaporation, formation of clouds, you remember this from 5th grade, right? Precipitation, condensation, precipitation, runoff, evaporation again. The hydrologic cycle is the climate cycle. And as we change the climate, we will fundamentally affect water resources and water resource demands and water systems that we've built. There is irrefutable scientific evidence that the climate's changing, that it's changing because of human activities, and that the changes will get worse and worse exponentially the longer we fail to do anything about greenhouse gas emissions. And those changes are going to be felt not just globally, but locally, through temperature, rainfall, snowfall and snowmelt dynamics, storm frequency, sea levels, food production, the health of our cities, you name it. We're embedded in the climate. The climate is all around us, and it fundamentally will affect many things. And that issue is going to be central to our lives for decades to come. That's the reality. Fifth, okay, I said something about this not being depressing. I don't know what I had in mind. Water and politics makes a volatile mix. Competition for fresh water is growing between sectors, among different sectors, among users, across regions. And along with that competition for water is a risk of conflict and violence over water allocation and use. Water has for millennia been a source of tension and conflict and violence. It's been a target of wars that start for other reasons. It's been a tool of violence. It's been a political issue. Fights over and with water are found throughout myths and legends and history, from the war between Umma and Lagash, two ancient cities in Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago, to modern battles along the Colorado River that may not have been violent but had the threat of violence. Between the US and Mexico, between cities and farms, between Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, between Nevada and Utah. One of the things we do at the Pacific Institute is we maintain an online bibliography and database of water conflicts. If you're interested in history, Google water conflict chronology, and you'll find the Pacific Institute's chronology. It's Google Maps with a database on water conflicts from 5,000 years ago up until a few weeks ago. And these risks of conflict are partly a question of rights, water rights and human rights, and I'll come back to that. Okay, enough on the crisis. Our first traditional reaction to these kinds of problems is that we just need to pay more attention. We need to put more effort into the water issue. We need to put more money into the water issue. And I think that's true, partly. But I'd like to argue that doing more of the same isn't going to be enough. That the tools and methods that we used in the 20th century, they brought great benefits to us. But they also brought some unexpected problems, economic, social, political, environmental problems that we see all around us, and they haven't solved our water problems. And so I think it's time to look elsewhere for new ideas and new answers. We need a new way of thinking about water, what I call a soft path for water. And the soft path has several key elements, and I won't go into enormous detail, but I'm going to touch on some of the pieces of this. We have to rethink basic human and ecological needs for water. We have to rethink what we mean by both supply, which is the way we thought about water in the past, and demand, which we sort of ignored in the past for water. We have to protect and rethink water quality, and we have to rethink water economics and water institutions. And all of those are part of moving toward a sustainable future. And the human right to water is intertwined with every one of those issues. So first, we have to rethink and we have to refocus our efforts on meeting basic human needs for all humans and for the environment, both, as a top priority. Governments, international aid organizations, corporations, private groups at all levels have to join forces to provide the goal of meeting minimum basic human needs for water as a fundamental human right. I thought it was interesting, Bob talked about in the introduction about the US Constitution and the fact that it doesn't say anything about water. Let me come back to that. It's an interesting point, and it's not unique to the United States. Second, we need to rethink supply and demand. And we have to become more productive in our use of water in every community, in every end use. Supply used to mean, where can I find another river? Where can I build another dam? Where can I drill another groundwater well to tap into the natural endowment of water around the world? How can we move water from a water-rich area to a water-poor area? I think we've reached in the United States and in many developed countries the limits of our ability to tap new supply. We're at the renewable limits of the Colorado River. We could want more water from the Colorado River, but we can't have any more. We've reached the limits on non-renewable groundwater aquifers. We are reaching peak water constraints, and a colleague of mine and I wrote a paper last year called Peak Water, in which we described some of these limits to supply. I do believe there are parts of the world where we need new infrastructure, new big infrastructure, maybe new dams and centralized water treatment systems. Maud Barlow and I may disagree a little bit in this. She said, let's have a moratorium. I think there are parts of the world where we need new infrastructure. But even there, I would argue we have to build that infrastructure to a different set of standards than we built them in the 20th century, when all we thought about was economic benefits, and we ignored local communities, we ignored downstream communities, we ignored ecosystems, we ignored a whole lot of things. That era has to be over. But that's not going to be enough. I think we need to rethink supply in a much broader sense, and I think it means thinking outside of the box. Rather than taking more water from overtapped rivers and aquifers, let's look to smart conjunctive use of surface water and groundwater together. Let's recharge our groundwater aquifers in wet years and then use them as reservoirs in dry years. The smartest new storage system, in my mind, in the western United States isn't surface storage, it's groundwater storage. And that means smarter joint management of surface water and groundwater. In some parts of the world, we have to relearn traditional sources of water management and things like rainwater harvesting where it's appropriate. We have to realize that treated wastewater isn't a liability, it's an asset. We spent a lot of money collecting wastewater and treating it to a high standard and then throwing it away. So let's think about where we can use treated wastewater for appropriate end uses. Let's look in some cases to advanced technology like desalination or advanced treatment. So I think there are lots of interesting, innovative answers on the supply side, but I don't think they're in the traditional supply fields. But the other side of the equation is demand. How are we using water? For what? In the 20th century, the assumption was simply, whatever the demand for water is, we'll figure out a way to meet it. Las Vegas could grow as big as it wants, and we'll figure out a way to provide the water. We'll move water from where we have it to where we want it. We didn't integrate planning, land use planning, urban development, with resource planning in general and water planning in particular. We can't do that any longer. We've reached the point of peak water in many places. Economics, environmental limits, political limits all tell us it's time to rethink the way we use water. So think about it this way. In the end, our goal isn't to use water. Our goal is to have a healthy economy and life, liberty, and happiness. It's to produce goods and services. It's to grow food. It's to have clean clothes. It's to make semiconductors. We as a society want things, substantive things, philosophical things, spiritual things. We want things. Almost everything we want, I would argue, requires water to some degree. But I would also argue that almost everything we want requires less water than we're spending to provide those things. And that's it in a nutshell. Can we satisfy our desires with less water? And I would also go on to argue that the answer to that is a resounding yes, that there is inefficient water use in every sector of our society, from industry to commerce to agriculture to our homes to our farms. Let's look to demand management and smart efficiency improvements and conservation to meet our needs for goods and services with less water. Let's grow more food with less water. Let's make semiconductors with less water. Let's flush our toilets with less water. Okay, the good news is this is already happening. And here's a fact that if you remember nothing else, try and remember this because it will astound and amaze your friends. The United States uses less water today for everything than we used 30 years ago. A lot less water. We use less water today than we used 30 years ago. Our economy has continued to grow exponentially, which economists love to see for reasons I'm not going to get into. Our populations continue to grow exponentially for reasons we've paid no attention to, which I won't get into either. But our demand for water has not. We use less water today than we used 30 years ago. And so on a per capita basis, we use a lot less water than we used 30 years ago. The city of Los Angeles recently announced that they used less water in 2010 than they used in 1980. And that's true for San Francisco, it's true for New York, it's true for California as a whole. It's true sort of, not everywhere, but it's sort of true in most places, in most sectors. Why? A lot of reasons. One is we're becoming more efficient at doing what we want to do. We used to flush our toilets with 6-gallon per flush toilets. That was the standard in 1980. The current legal standard in the US is 1.6 gallons per flush. And there are plenty of incredibly great toilets on the market that use 1.1 gallons per flush. Look, if you're replacing a toilet, look at the standards and get a high quality toilet. It's a remarkable change. That's a 75 or 80% reduction in the water to flush toilets. Maud made a comment last night in her talk. How many of you were here for Maud Barlow's talk? Okay, so lots of you. So you remember her comment about the flush toilet. We love our flush toilets, but it's a great way to contaminate a huge amount of water all at once and then spend a lot of money to have to collect that water and treat it again. But we love our flush toilets. Let's just make them more efficient. How many of you have front-loading washing machines? Okay, let me ask it the other way. How many of you have top-loading washing machines? Okay. Front-loading washing machines save a huge amount of water and energy and detergent. They pay for themselves relatively quickly. Depends on where you are, the price of water, the price of energy. They do a better job washing your clothes. So many of you have made the switch over time as your washing machines have gotten old and you've replaced them, or because you saw these savings. It's an example of our ability to wash our clothes and provide the benefit we want with less water, fewer resources. We've also seen some fundamental changes in the structure of our economy. We have fewer water-intensive industries in the US than we had 30 or 40 years ago. And to some degree, that means we've exported our water demand. So we make less steel in the United States now, a water-intensive industry, and we import more of it. And so that's water that we're importing, that we're not using domestically. So that's a part of it, but I actually think that's a small part of it. And to give you another specific example, even in the steel industry, there have been remarkable improvements in efficiency. In 1920, it took 200 tons of water to make a ton of steel. That's just the way we did it. By 1980, it was 20 tons of water to make a ton of steel. The best steel plants around the world today use 3 or 4 tons of water to make a ton of steel. That's a 98% reduction in water requirements for steel production from the 1920s. So even there have been enormous improvements in steel water use efficiency. It used to take 30 gallons of water to make a square inch of semiconductors. The best semiconductor plants in the US now use 4 or 5. So efficiency, it's a huge way to tackle the demand question. All right, that was a long digression on demand, but I think the demand for water is a key piece of this. Third, we have to protect water quality. We have to protect the quality of our tap water. Part of the reason people drink bottled water is they're afraid of their tap water. Right or wrong, they're afraid of their tap water. Or they don't like the taste of their tap water, or bottled water is convenient, or they've been convinced by marketing that it's going to make them sexier or skinnier or something. But part of it is fear of tap water. Let's protect our tap water quality. We have a remarkable tap water system in the United States. It provides great quality tap water, but I'd be the first to acknowledge that it could be better. We need to upgrade it. There are new contaminants that need to be removed from our water. We know how to protect tap water. We can do it at a cost far lower than the cost of bottled water. And different water demands require waters of different quality. So when I said earlier, let's figure out how to use treated wastewater, we don't need potable water to flush our toilets or to water our lawns or to wash our cars. Let's match the quality of the water we need with the qualities of the water we have. And that offers enormous opportunities. Fourth, let's use smart economics and smart institutions to tackle our water problems. The failure to price water properly leads to overuse, it leads to underinvestment, it leads to poor economic decisions. Most of us don't pay enough for our water. But water also must be priced fairly to reflect costs, equity, efficiency, and many other factors. And that means eliminating some subsidies for water and maybe providing other kinds of subsidies for water. Let's recognize both the human right to water and the economic value of water, and I'll come back to that. And we have to improve our institutions. Charles Darwin said, in a comment completely unrelated to evolution, quote, "If the misery of our poor be caused not by the laws of nature, but by our institutions, great is our sin." And to some degree, the misery of our water problems are not caused by the laws of nature, but by our institutions. We have to manage water better. It needs to be managed at the local level better. It needs to be managed at the federal level better. We have to do a better job of bringing people back into the decision-making process around water, and all of that's going to require institutional reform. So those are pieces of the soft path for water. And as I said earlier, they're all woven around this question of the human right to water. So more than a decade ago, again, as Bob mentioned, I wrote a paper on the human right to water, exploring the legal and political and moral and practical issues involved in the debate. A friend and colleague of mine, Professor Steve McCaffrey, who's at the University of the Pacific Law School, wrote an earlier paper on the human right to water from a legal perspective that really was a groundbreaking analysis of this, laying out the legal issues around the question. I believe that looking at previous human rights law, at international statements, at national laws, at constitutions, all elements that are woven into the mix of what we consider international law, support clearly a formal human right to water. And I mean this in the full legal, moral, ethical, and practical sense. Now, there may be some of you or most of you who don't think that that's an unusual statement, or wonder how there could be any controversy around that, or why it might be important or relevant. There are others of you who may think that that's very controversial, and there are a lot of complex issues entangled in the debate about water as a human right. What does it mean? What are the responsibility of states with a capital S, or governments? What are the issues around enforcement and the intersection between international law and legal systems within countries? Those are difficult, practical questions. And in the debate around water, there's another ideology that parallels and conflicts with the ideology that there's a human right to water, and that's the idea that water's an economic good. That idea at its extreme, that water's an economic good, that all we have to do to solve our water problems is give it a price, entirely subjected to the laws of supply and demand and the free market. I have friends who are economists, I admit, and we argue about these points all the time. And wrapped up in this debate is a series of questions about pricing and equity and markets and water rights as opposed to human rights. But if water's a human right, what does that say about the economics of water? Can you price water if it's a human right? Can you sell water or market it? If it's purely an economic good, what does that say about equity, about access to fundamental basic human needs for survival, for poverty, for water for the environment? What does that mean? There are some free market economists and capitalist economies and conservative thinkers who are generally opposed to the idea of extending human rights law from the political sphere, where they're typically extremely supportive of human rights, to the sphere of social, economic, and cultural rights. And they oppose including water, and have opposed it for a long time, arguing that that just extends government control over a resource that can be more efficiently allocated by the private sector or by local communities. Now, on the other side, there are some environmental activists who see a declaration of a human right to water as a wedge that they can use to oppose all private participation in water use and management and allocation and marketing. They think of it as a tool that they can use to fight the broader fight against privatization of water. They don't just believe that there should be comprehensive access to water for all. They believe that it should be publicly provided, often for free, with no private involvement. The reality, like most realities in my mind, falls somewhere in between these extremes. Those are sort of caricatures of the real world. Although I would note that as a society, we've sort of gotten bad at that middle discourse, at qualified statements, at nuance, to our great detriment. And I see this in the water debate as well. I think water is both an economic good, very clearly, and it's also very clearly a human right. And so how do you accept that and then figure out how to make those things not conflict? So a slight digression to get back to this question of the Constitution. So the US Constitution doesn't have the word water in it. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 didn't have the word water in it. Water's not mentioned in the 1966 International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the keystone convention on non-political rights, but on economic, social, and cultural rights. It's not mentioned in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in 1966, or the Declaration of the Right to Development, or the European Convention on Human Rights. So it's just not there. Why? Did the drafters mean to exclude water? Did they, as Bob suggested, think it was so fundamental that they didn't even think it needed to be made explicit? For example, there's no human right to air in any of those things either. Or third, did they think of it as a derivative right necessary for the progressive realization of the other rights for which they were much more explicit, the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or in the human rights world, health, or well-being? There are explicit rights that water is required, for which water is a fundamental need. I'm not going to get into that, but I think a lot of those things played into the fact that it's not in those previous statements and declarations and covenants. I think they didn't think about it. But I also think that it's clearly derivative. It's clearly a necessary to satisfy these other more explicit rights. And in the end, that's what the UN human rights discussions revolved around. And I'll spare you the decade-long history of the debate about it. Maud talked about some of it last night, but it was pretty remarkable. There's been debates about it at the UN, that in international negotiations around water, in new revisions of constitutions at the national level, including the South African Constitution, which now has an explicit declaration of a human right and an ecosystem right to water. The world has tried to make it more explicit in the last several years, and especially in the last few months. As Maud Barlow noted, the General Assembly resolution in July 64/292 made an explicit declaration that there was a human right to water and sanitation, which was remarkable. Sanitation was sort of snuck in there in the end. It wasn't really a part of the discussion very much, but it's in there now. And that was signed by many nations, and there were no no votes. The United States didn't vote no for the first time in 20 years. And then the Human Rights Council in Geneva in September issued what is considered a binding resolution declaring a human right to water. It was a wonderful thing. That resolution states, quote, it quote, affirms that the human right to safe drinking water and sanitation is derivative, from the right to an adequate standard of living and inextricably related to the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, as well as the right to life and human dignity, end of quote. In short, the resolution says there's a human right to safe drinking water and sanitation. It's groundbreaking. So, in the end, what's the advantage of declaring a human right to water? And let's be realistic. There's a human right to food, and there has been for a long time, and 800 to 900 million people go to bed hungry every night. So declaring a human right to water isn't magically going to solve the water problem. But let me offer 4 reasons for why I think it's important. First, acknowledging such a right encourages the international community and individual governments to meet their responsibilities to provide basic human needs for water and sanitation. I hope will help reinvigorate that effort. Second, by acknowledging such a right, pressures to translate that right into specific national and international legal obligations and responsibilities are much more likely to occur. And in fact, the debate now has shifted from is there a human right to water to yes, what does it mean? What are the rights and responsibilities and obligations and legal issues? What does it really mean? And that's happening. Third, it will help maintain a spotlight of attention on the deplorable state of water management in many parts of the world. And we already see examples where the human right to water is now being used as leverage to help fix problems with water management. Fourth, explicitly acknowledging a human right to water, I think, can help set priorities for water. So we fail to meet basic human needs for water, not because there isn't enough water in especially developing countries where the failure is the most egregious, but because other countries have a lot of difficult choices to make. Education, health, communications, roads, water, electricity. Water is one of a number of serious problems. I think it's basic. And maybe the human right to water will help refocus attention on priorities of national governments to address this basic need. There is a fifth reason, which I don't usually trot out, but I just think it's the right thing to do from a moral standpoint. That doesn't carry a whole lot of weight, typically, but I lay it out there as an opinion. So, will declaring a human right to water actually change anything? I don't know. I do think it's the right thing to do. I think the resolution itself, the accompanying documents lay out pretty clear state responsibilities about developing tools and mechanisms to progressively realize, to achieve progressively the full realization of the right. It ensures transparency in the planning and implementation phases of providing safe water. It integrates human rights into impacts assessments. It helps with regulatory frameworks. It provides perhaps a remedy for human rights violations by putting in place accessible accountability mechanisms. I see lots of advantages. In the end, I don't think meeting the basic human needs for water and sanitation will finally happen just because we've declared a human right to water. There are a lot of other things we need to do, and I've laid some of them out in terms of priorities, in terms of rethinking supply and demand, in terms of redefining economics, upgrading our institutions. I think there are lots of success stories out there of smart things that are being done every day by cities, by farmers, by countries, by industry to move along the soft path. And in the end, all we can do is push our way faster and faster down this path toward a sustainable future. Thank you very much. So we have time for questions. I love to answer questions. I'm sure with an audience that, you came out to hear about water. I'm sure you're interested in this issue. So, do we have a microphone, or is that, are you going to have to yell?
Where is it?
Yeah. There's a microphone coming.
Once an aquifer is completely drained, is there any way we can replenish it?
Okay. So a quick, simple hydrology lesson. Groundwater aquifers come in many different kinds, in many different places. Groundwater is basically water in the soil and the rocks underground. It's not a big pool. Some groundwater aquifers, groundwater gets its water from rain. Rain runs off, hits the ground, it either runs off right away in rivers or it seeps into the ground, into groundwater. And so recharge occurs naturally through rainfall. But the rate at which groundwater is recharged depends on the geology of the region. Some groundwater aquifers are recharged very, very rapidly. We pump them in dry parts of the year and then it rains and the levels go back up and they're completely sustainable. Some aquifers are literally what we call fossil aquifers. They were filled over tens of thousands or longer years, like in southern Libya, in the desert areas. They're huge underground aquifers of water in very dry parts of the planet, but they're not being recharged because they're very dry. And so when we pump them, the groundwater levels drop. It's like oil. It's non-renewable. So whether or not they're refilled depends on the geology, it depends on the climate, depends on human use. When I talk briefly about conjunctive use of surface water and groundwater, in California and in much of the West, we overpump groundwater in many places. But in some of those places, if we were smart, in wet years, we could recharge groundwater. We could refill groundwater aquifers. If there's no, sometimes when you overpump them, there's compaction of the soils and that ruins them. But there are lots of groundwater aquifers where we could treat them sort of like man-made reservoirs and build them into our management system. And that, I think that's going to be a key to Western U.S. water management going forward, because we're not going to build more surface water reservoirs, really.
Question?
In the very back?
Hi, I have a question about where the right to water appropriately should reside in the new mechanism. Described as in the new declaration of human rights council being removed from
That's a great question that I am uniquely unqualified to answer. or grossly unqualified to answer. I honestly don't know. It clearly falls in the economic, social, and cultural rights area, not the political rights area. But somebody could easily argue to me that, well, in fact, there are political rights involved in denying access to water. I just honestly don't know. I think we're going to learn in the next few years about where this is going to be fought. Is it going to be fought at national government levels? Is there an international mechanism? There probably aren't great international mechanisms for dealing with these things. Is it not going to have any effect ultimately on legal issues? Honestly, I don't know. I'm not qualified to answer that. No. I really don't. I love to answer questions, and I often answer questions about which I know little, but here I could, especially with this audience, I think I could really get into trouble. And Joe Delapenna is here. He's got his hand up. He's a lawyer and thought about these, so.
It's true that the Convention on Social and Economic Rights has not been ratified as widely as many other human rights conventions, but the right to health, right to an adequate standard of living are also protected by other conventions that have been more widely ratified, such as the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, the United States hasn't ratified either of those, but we in Saudi Arabia are the lone holdouts on, I think it's the rights of the child, for example.
Yeah.
And so if you take into account all of the treaties which protect the right to health, the right to adequate standard of living, it does cover most of the rest of the world. Now the question is, of course, is Human Rights Council going to do that? Or is it going to take yet another political mobilization to get them to address those concerns under other human rights treaties?
Yeah. Maud Barlow last night gave an interesting example of a national case of this where in the Kalahari, the people who live in the Kalahari fought for their water rights. They were being deprived of water rights. They went to the Supreme Court in Botswana and they ultimately won. And she argued that it was partly on the grounds of the human right to water at the international level, that the national courts realized that that was an important principle and that played a role. I don't know if that's the case, but to some degree, these will be dealt with at the national level. And Johannesburg water case, the Fiery water case in South Africa, there are some examples.
Hi, please comment on cloud seeding. Is this a real solution on any level, or is it a false one?
Okay, so cloud seeding, for those of you who don't know, is the idea that clouds hold moisture, and there's the belief that there are artificial ways of wringing that moisture out faster than nature would wring it out, that you can make rainfall. It's been practiced in parts of the western US, it's been practiced in China. The evidence is mixed at best, partly because we have no control of the experiment. We don't know if it would have rained anyway. It's hard to know. You can't do the experiment and know if you're really being effective. There's been some opposition because people downstream think you're stealing my rain. It would have rained the next day a few miles downstream, and so that's been a political problem. To the best of my scientific ability to understand it, and I'm a scientist and climatologist by training, it seems to have sometimes, under some circumstances, some local effect, but I don't think it's going to be a long-term solution. It may modestly increase rainfall in a few regions, and the Chinese are pushing it in some regions, but it's sort of a local effect. So I don't see it as a big solution.
Thanks. Could you talk a little bit about, some people have made the claim that increasing efficiency will fuel growth, and at some point the demand will harden. And here in Utah, we live in such a variable climate. If we're being as efficient as we can, and then there's a dry year, people have claimed that we'd be up a creek, so to speak. Could you comment a little bit on that and the potential for?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question is, isn't it possible that if you improve efficiency, you're simply freeing up water that can be used for more growth, that it gets taken up and used? That's basically what you're asking. It's called demand hardening in the urban sector. That it makes it harder during a drought to cut back because you've squeezed the last wasted water out of the system. Both of those issues are important and of debate in the efficiency debate. Possibly. This raises, here's the issue. It raises the question of water policy. I get into this debate, and I'm in it right now, today, once again, with a subset of people in California water politics who argue that there's no potential to improve efficiency in the ag sector in California because the water's being used downstream by somebody, or the farmer will just take that water and use it to grow more food, or they'll put it on land that they weren't using before. That's possible, but that's a policy question. We could improve the efficiency of agricultural water use and grow as much food as we're growing with less water, and take that water and restore ecosystems or make markets with it or give it to urban sector. That's a policy question. Or we could grow more food with it. I think that's still an improvement in efficiency. You're getting more crop per drop. If we want the water for ecosystems, then you have to develop the policies to capture the efficiency improvements. It's entirely possible that if you improve efficiency, all you're doing is providing more water for urban growth. That's a land use planning question. And it doesn't lead to the conclusion in my mind that you shouldn't improve efficiency. So let's figure out how to improve efficiency, and let's have the debate about what to use the water for. I would also note that improving efficiency saves you money because you're buying less water. It saves energy because you're using less water to treat and deliver the water to your home, and less energy to then treat the wastewater you produce. There are all sorts of other advantages to efficiency as well. So I don't support the idea of demand hardening, and I don't think it's a good argument against efficiency. Wow. Yes.
Given existing world sustainable water supplies, what is the size of the population for the world that those can legitimately support?
Another great question, and a very difficult one. The carrying capacity of the planet depends on a lot of different things. It depends on where they are. It depends on the lifestyle and quality of life you want. I think the planet could support a lot more people at an increasingly miserable state of quality of life. You know, I mean, you can't have 7 billion people on the planet, which we're approaching very rapidly, at the level of consumption of the United States. And so the debate in the sustainability world is population, affluence, and technology. You can play games with all of those things. You can have a higher population at a lower level of affluence. You can have a higher population and a better level of affluence if you have technology that improves efficiency. We have to balance all of those things, and we haven't had that debate. There's plenty of water on the planet. You know, 97% of it's salt water. If we wanted to spend the money and the energy to desalinate it, we could meet basic human needs for water at a high economic and energy and probably environmental costs. We could do that. So it's a difficult question, and it partly depends on the assumptions we want to make. There's been a big literature about carrying capacity of the globe, and the range is huge.
Well, just one short, quick comment. You wondered whether simply declaring right to water is going to lead to anything that's concrete or substantive, because often we know it's just the empty rhetoric of rights is there on paper and that's it. One way it can have some effect is that if we can change the discourse, the normative discourse of rights, to change that idea of soft right into hard right, in the sense that when we think of right or access to water as a human right, as a positive right, that's where all these vague questions come in. But if we can't think of it as not harming others, which is negative right, that's where there's a lot of teeth to it. And if we do try to understand that the right to water is a question of whether they're being harmed, those who are getting harmed, and we have to stop harming them, and you construe that in this negative way, then soft right ends up being a hard right, and that's where legislation is much easier to go for and handle it that way. So that's just one way. Perhaps we need to change the rhetoric and the discourse of the normative discourse of the issue.
Thank you. I accept that comment. Yeah, the question, for those of you who might not have heard it, was related to the growing effort to develop renewable energy. The concern about climate change is trying to push us off of fossil fuels, but there are water implications of our energy choices, but including renewables. And in the western United States, there's been a big debate about central solar systems that require water for cooling. In the desert, lots of sun, not so much water. How do we deal with that? There are very close connections between water and energy. It takes a lot of water to produce and use energy, all forms of energy. Fossil fuels, the debate about fracking and natural gas, oil shale, coal, regular petroleum. I mean, there's water for every aspect of this. And there's been quite a bit of work done quantifying how much water is required to produce a kilowatt hour of energy of any particular kind. Some renewables require significant amounts of water, especially centralized solar thermal power plants. In general, renewables require a lot less water per kilowatt hour than traditional fossil fuels. And so in general, moving to renewables actually is a benefit on the water side. In California recently, some proposals to build central solar plants there was a debate about in the permitting process, and those plants were required to use dry cooling systems, which use less water than wet cooling systems. So there was some recognition that we could do things a little more carefully if we think about water as an issue. And the classic example of failing to think about water in this area is ethanol. Okay, so there are a few things that I support more strongly than getting off of oil. If we can figure out how to import less oil from the Persian Gulf, this country's going to be far better off. And so in that context, ethanol makes a lot of sense. Grow domestic something and turn it into ethanol, plants and grow it in, okay, that makes sense. But that's a very narrow perspective because it doesn't think about water. It doesn't think about food prices around the world. It was sort of a bad answer to a real problem, and it was the result of our failing to think about water and energy and climate and food in an integrated way. And I would just argue that as we make an energy transition, which we have to do, we'll only make the right kind of transition if we include water. So one more. Oh God. Yeah.
One question. Jared Diamond has explored collapse, the fate of civilizations, why they come and go, and there's talk of climate change impacts to the Southwest settlements. I'm just curious if you might make some guesses about what you see coming to southwestern cities' water use in the coming decades, not in the next couple of years, but decades from now.
Yeah, I just actually had a paper last month or a couple of months ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences about the Southwest and climate change. The models, climate models, okay, so I said very clearly and definitively that climate change is a real problem. I don't want to suggest that there aren't uncertainties. There are plenty of uncertainties about the rate of climate change, the nature of climate change, the regional impacts of climate change. We don't have a great handle on precipitation patterns. The models at the moment are suggesting with more and more confidence that the Southwest is going to be drier. It's certainly going to be hotter. So even if rainfall doesn't drop, you need more rain just to stay even. And the models are suggesting, in fact, it's going to be drier. The Colorado River is at its limit. We've maxed out on withdrawals from the Colorado River, and if there's a decrease in average flow of the Colorado, things are going to go politically ugly over time. Now, they're already politically ugly. The 7 states fight. We have a treaty with Mexico, but it doesn't say anything about climate change. I think it's going to be an institutional challenge to deal with the reality without climate change in the Southwest. And I think it's going to be much harder to deal with the reality with climate change. It's going to impose new stresses. I do think there are solutions, but we're not integrating climate change into our long-term planning. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Just to remind you again, we're reconvening at 2 p.m. up at the Fort Douglas Officers Club. It's free. No registration. Please join us.